Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Lewis McGlynn. I'm joined in the studio today by Linda Fabiani, former MSP for East Kilbride. Linda, how are you today?
I'm absolutely grand. Thank you very much, Lewis, and happy to be here.
Starting us off tonight with our Ukraine update on day 428 of the Russian invasion. Relations with European countries are at their lowest possible level, the Kremlin has said, adding that each wave of expulsions of Russian diplomats is reducing the space for diplomacy. Germany is one of the latest countries to send diplomats home, expelling 20 on Saturday, with Russia responding by expelling 40. The Russian government spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, repeated that the Kremlin welcomed the call between China and Ukraine on Wednesday, adding, "We are ready to welcome anything that could hasten the end of the conflict in Ukraine and Russia achieving all the goals it has set itself." NATO allies have delivered almost all their promised combat vehicles to Ukraine, the Transatlantic Defence Alliance Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has said. More than 98% of combat vehicles were promised to Ukraine have been delivered. Stoltenberg said at a news briefing, adding that Kiev now has the military capabilities it needs to recapture territory. EU diplomats are still seeking to convince Central and Eastern European countries to extend Ukraine's tariff-free access to the EU market for another year. The EU dropped tariff barriers on Ukrainian grain after the Russian invasion last year and is now seeking to extend the policy, which expires on the 5th of June. A Russian missile strike has hit apartment buildings in the Ukrainian city of Mykolaiv overnight, killing one person and injuring 23 more. The remains of an unidentified aerial military object have been found in the northern Poland near the city of Bydgoszcz. Poland's defense ministry said and its justice minister have said. The head of Russia's Wagner mercenary force said Ukrainian troops were pouring into the area around Bakhmut ahead of an inevitable Ukrainian counteroffensive. For months, Russian forces have been pounding the city of Bakhmut, the focal point of their attempts to capture the eastern Ukrainian industrial region of Donbass. China's President Xi Jinping spoke to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky on Wednesday for the first time since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Kiev had publicly sought such talks for months, with Zelensky describing the hour's phone call as long and meaningful. Xi told Zelensky that China would send special representatives to Ukraine and hold talks with all parties seeking peace, Chinese state media reported. The White House welcomed the phone call but said it was too soon to tell whether it would lead to a peace deal. Linda, how do you think China's interposition into these talks will lead to peace?
Well, I think it's really, really interesting. I was quite pleased to hear about it this morning when I first heard about that. And of course, we never know. You know, China is one of these countries that you never know what's behind what they're actually doing, the Chinese government. They did meet with Russia fairly recently. So I think it's really interesting that President Zelensky has had that discussion. I think it's really interesting that China, has now said they're willing to have these talks to see if they could improve the situation. I was interested in what you read out about Russia's response to that. Saying we'll welcome anything that will end the conflict and Russia achieving all the goals it has set itself. It's the kind of talk that Russia does all the time. So I hope very much that that's not the starting point for China, because then I would think that the talks are just doomed to failure. But I also don't think President Zelensky would be going forward if that was what he initially picked up from his first discussions. So anything is hopeful. Any discussion is hopeful. So let's see what comes of this. Too soon to comment, really, on what will happen, but surely talking is good news. And I think China now being willing to talk to Ukraine has got to be good news as well. Loads of other stuff in your report too. The thing about the grain, I hope that the EU does agree to extend the tariff-free time for the grain. I think that's really important for Ukraine at the moment. Times are hard, more people killed. It just seems to be going on for so much longer than any of us ever thought it would, or indeed hoped it would. But on it goes.
Next up. Renewed clashes in the Khartoum and southwest Sudan have raised fears that the current 3-day ceasefire, due to expire on Thursday night, will not be extended and fighting will instead intensify. A surge in violence would threaten the evacuation of thousands of foreign nationals who remain in Sudan. UK military chiefs said flights would continue as long as conditions were safe enough, although the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, said the UK cannot guarantee how many would depart once the ceasefire ends. The violence in Sudan has pitted army units loyal to its military de facto ruler, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, against the rapid support forces, paramilitaries led by a warlord called Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemedi. The Sudanese army said on Wednesday that Burhan had given initial approval to a plan to extend the truce for another 72 hours and send an army envoy to the South Sudan capital of Juba for talks. There was no immediate response from the RSF to the proposal from the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, a regional bloc. Foreign Secretary James Cleverly has said the UK could not guarantee evacuation flights from Sudan would continue into Friday, but has come under pressure over the refusal to allow Britons in the country to take elderly parents with them. Mr Cleverly told MPs on this afternoon that the UK would endeavour to keep the airlift route going until the ceasefire is due to end at midnight local time, although he said he could not guarantee this, and continued to advise UK citizens to leave immediately. Conservative MP Alicia Kearns called on Mr Cleverly to relax the evacuation requirements to allow UK citizens to take their Sudanese parents with them, amid reports that some were refusing to leave infirm mothers or fathers behind. Children we treat as dependents, but very elderly sick parents should also be treated as dependents, said Kearns, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, adding it was not clear whether the Home Office or the Foreign Office was determining the criteria. The UK has been evacuating civilians from their Wadi Sedna airbase, north of Khartoum, since Tuesday, airlifting 536 in a series of flights going via Cyprus to the UK, but it will only pick up British nationals, their spouses, and children under 18. The fragile 72-hour ceasefire is due to end at midnight, but the UK hopes to be able to continue the evacuation if people can make it to the airfield safely. Linda, do you think the British government took too long to organise the evacuation of UK citizens?
Well, yes, I do. When you look at Germany and France, for example, we're way ahead of the UK government. And I understand that they didn't just lift their own nationals, they lifted other people from other countries as well to safety. Yes, we were way behind. And I immediately, when I heard the reports about it, thought of Afghanistan. We were way behind in Afghanistan as well. And I did think it bizarre that the very first thing they did was out and lifted the British diplomats. That was the first people to leave, courtesy of the UK. And I thought, surely they're the people that are supposed to be helping organise UK nationals to be leaving Sudan. Yet they're lifted out first, and that must leave behind a degree of chaos. I've heard reports of people who were trying to email, weren't getting proper responses apart from standard responses, and then days later still hadn't heard anything. That lady herself, what was it, the Lady Cairns, chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, she herself said that there was, Foreign Office and Home Office confusion, who was responsible for what. So it doesn't seem that there is any kind of set procedure plans in place for any of these emergency evacuations that are required. Why does it seem to be so difficult for the UK to do this when other countries seem to be able to do it more precisely and with a lot more organisation? So, yeah.
And the other thing that MP Cairns touched on was the idea of elderly parents being almost left behind. How do you feel the government should respond to these issues?
That is just so difficult. I don't know what other countries did about that, but the idea of having to leave your elderly parents behind in a war zone. And the situation in Sudan for decades now is such that when strife does break out, it's brutal and it's horrifying. The whole situation in South Sudan before there was the peace agreement that allowed South Sudan to become a nation on its own. Horrendous what was happening there. And it's largely the same troops who are fighting now that were carrying out incursions into South Sudan, for example, and terrorising people. The whole massive country of Sudan is in turmoil. It's spilling into South Sudan as well, I understand, at border level. So it must be absolutely terrifying for the people who are there. And really, I think it's a duty of any government to act in an organised fashion and to act with compassion. But I'm afraid the UK government doesn't seem to have compassion in its soul at all in any situation.
The SNP has condemned the Scottish Tory MPs for backing the illegal migration bill, warning the passing of this legislation heralds a dark time for the UK. With the exception of Douglas Ross, who didn't vote, every Scottish Tory MP backed the bill, which will trample over human rights legislation and roll back on decades of protection for desperate asylum seekers fleeing persecution and war, just as the world is forced to respond to the crises in Ukraine, Sudan, Afghanistan, and Syria. The legislation has been widely criticised as contravening the Refugees Convention, the ECHR, and the European Convention on the Action on Trafficking, as well as the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Commenting, the SNP's Home Affairs spokesperson, Alison Thewlis, MP, said, "The passing of this legislation heralds a dark time for the UK, one that has sullied the nation's reputation as an open, welcoming place to which those fleeing persecution and war are welcome to. Scotland's Tory MPs should hang their heads in shame. Just as the world is responding to the crises in Ukraine, Sudan, Afghanistan and Syria and opening themselves up to people seeking safety, Scottish Tories have callously backed closing off our borders to those who need our help the most. This nasty piece of legislation has erased the Refugee Convention and the Human Rights Convention, as well as destroying the Modern Slavery Act protections for victims of trafficking." Ms Thewlis emphasised that the legislation does not pass in Scotland's name. She said that Scotland stands shoulder to shoulder with those fleeing unimaginable circumstances to seek safety in this country, and Scotland will do all we can to show them dignity and respect. How do you think the passing of this legislation will affect the perception of the UK as a whole on the global stage?
Well, certainly on the global stage, UK's reputation in such matters and in matters of human rights has been plummeting over the last few years. And the Conservatives in Westminster don't seem to care about that at all. I talked about compassion earlier in relation to Sudan. And certainly, again, we have a UK government that shows no compassion whatsoever. You know, Alison Thewlis said, "Not in Scotland's name." You know, it breaks my heart that this is one issue that Scotland has absolutely no say over whatsoever, because it's a matter reserved to Westminster. So what Scotland wants to do in relation to helping desperate people, Scotland is not allowed to do. And all we can do is sit in the sidelines and watch. And I find it absolutely horrendous. I mean, you've got a government in Westminster who lack compassion, yeah, but they lie. They consistently tell lies about the number of refugees that are and asylum seekers that are coming to the UK. The reality is the vast majority of asylum seekers end up in neighbouring countries. They're not all lining up to come to the UK. In fact, one of the United Nations agencies confirmed that just recently, because the UK government had lied about how people were supposed to get here. The other thing they lie about is this thing about safe passage. There is no safe passage allowed by the UK in terms of asylum seekers. They cast aspersions as well. I mean, Suella Braverman, I think it was, or it might have been Kemi Badenoch, but it was one of the two of them, said the other day that criminality from those coming to our shore seeking asylum was rising. And that has been completely debunked because there's no records being kept at all of anything like that. So they lie, they cast aspersions on people, they lack compassion. And what they're doing now is putting through more legislation to hammer the most vulnerable people on the globe even further. And, you know, as you said, asked me, their standing has gone right down.
And do you think that this is a symptom of larger issues surrounding devolution, as this is not the first time in recent years that Scotland's government has felt almost incapable of doing what they want to do due to interference of Westminster?
Well, you know, it's sort of separate because it's always been, you know, it's not as if we have rights to do some of that stuff and the UK government are saying no, like they have over the GRR bill, like they may well do over the deposit return scheme. This is something that Scotland has never had any in on whatsoever. I mean, we have, for example, an immigration removal centre which sits in Lanarkshire. Scotland's Parliament is not allowed to get any official figures about what happens there. It's like a little part of Scotland that is just not Scotland because we have no rights over it whatsoever. So it's a constant bugbear to us. It's a bugbear to the churches in Scotland. It's a bugbear to all agencies in Scotland that see the result of asylum seekers being treated this way. And indeed, asylum seekers who end up destitute in the streets, because that's something else that the UK government allows to happen. And Scotland can do absolutely nothing about it. And it is against everything that I believe Scotland stands for. And yes, it's awful. This makes it even worse.
Proposals to tighten regulation of online gambling have been published by the government in a long-awaited shake-up of laws passed before smartphones put out the potential for 24-hour casino games and sports betting in every pocket. After multiple delays, the Department for Culture, Media and Sports released a white paper laying out its blueprint for regulating the modern gambling industry. The Culture Secretary, Lucy Fraser, told the House of Commons that gambling could wreck lives and ministers were bringing our pre-smartphone regulations into the present day with a gambling white paper for the digital age. The proposals include a 1% mandatory levy on industry revenues, tougher affordability checks to prevent huge losses, online slot machine stakes capped between £2 and £15, curbing free spin and bonus offers, measures to slow down online casino games, more resources for the Gambling Commission, plans for a gambling ombudsman. Nearly all of the measures will go out for further consultation, signalling a fresh delay to a process that began in late 2020 when the government launched a review promised in Boris Johnson's 2019 election manifesto. The White Paper updates the 2005 Gambling Act passed by the Blair government, which liberalised laws governing the sector in an attempt to foster a world-leading industry. Online gambling now accounts for the majority of the $11 billion that the sector generates from British punters every year. Fraser said that while many people enjoyed gambling without any ill effects, the industry was unrecognisable compared with the pre-smartphone age, and the addicts were suffering extreme harm. She said, "When gambling becomes addiction, it can wreck lives, shattered families, lost jobs, foreclosed homes, jail time, and suicide. A string of high-profile tragedies and broader concerns about addicts, vulnerable people and children have triggered growing calls for ministers to crack down on gambling, particularly online." Now, Linda, do you think that the government has taken too long to address these issues, considering the last major changes to this legislation was under Tony Blair's government 18 years ago?
Well, yeah, it's a long time, isn't it? They say a week's a long time in politics, 18 years is a heck of a long time. So the Tories came in 2010. So it took 9 years for it to be in a manifesto, 2019 in Boris Johnson's. And here we are, 4 years down the line, and it's gone out to further consultation. So it's likely to be yet another election, I would think, before anything is put in place. So yeah, it's far too long. And when you consider in that 18 years the way smartphones have appeared, and, you know, gambling on these smartphones, my goodness, you can't be on any game, adult game, without some advert coming up asking you to have free spins, free turns, trying to lure people in to gambling. And it's not as if folk haven't been shouting about this for a long time. I mean, when I was in Holyrood, for example, Stuart McMillan, MSP for Greenock, he was really working hard on this, trying to get things changed. His counterpart in Westminster, Ronnie Cowan, took it up there and was quite successful in small ways lobbying for, I think it was limits on slot machines in public places and in pubs and stuff like that. So people have known for a long, long time that this is a problem, and yet feet are getting dragged yet again. And it is a horrendous addiction. And nobody's saying stop gambling altogether, because, you know, people have the right to do so if they wish. But there should be safeguards in place that don't allow folk who end up addicted to, and they do wreck their families. I've seen it. As a constituency MSP, I've seen it. Lives get wrecked, families get wrecked, people lose their homes. And so it's far too long, and you start to wonder if they're actually serious about doing anything of it at all. A lot of talk.
And the proposed changes laid out, if they do go into effect, do you think those will have a noticeable effect, or is this more of a first step?
Well, it looks to me that probably first step's quite a good way of putting that, because this on its own I don't think will make a huge difference, Lewis. Sounds almost like lip service to doing something, but there's an awful lot more. And again, I mean, that's something else that Holyrood, Scotland's Parliament, has no control over. It's another reserved matter. But there's wider issues that are also reserved matters. It's all very well saying they'll limit how much you can spend at every given time. But we all know how easy it is for people to get credit these days, ridiculously easy. So, you know, people can end up getting credit here, credit there to fund this addiction in all different places. So I think there's also a need for far more warning systems, if you like, coming up. And making it less mainstream. As I say, it's on all the smartphones, but it's also on TV and mainstream TV channels. You know, if you sit at night and the TV sort of comes to an end, they go on to programmes where you can gamble. And I often, when I'm sitting there on my own watching that, think, if somebody's feeling really lonely and isolated, it would be far too easy just to pick up the phone and do something like this and end up in a terrible cycle of gambling, which could lead to a really bad addiction. So I would like, as they're going out to consultation again, I would hope that when it comes back yet again, that there will be some stronger measures in place.
The SNP has called for an urgent overhaul of the child maintenance service. It's desperately needed to help tackle child poverty. It comes as a report from the Work and Pensions Committee claimed issues with the CMS being slow and ineffective on enforcement for some parents and imposing unaffordable payments on others hindered efforts to tackle child poverty. Recommendations from the report include ending collect and pay fees for low-income households, faster action from the CMS in cases where payments between parents are not working, and improving the speed and effectiveness of enforcement action to ensure children aren't missing out on the maintenance due to them. Commenting, the SNP's Social Justice spokesperson and member of the Work and Pensions Committee, David Linden MP, said, "Parents must have confidence that the CMS is there to properly support separated families and children while doing so in a fair way. It's clear that this isn't currently the case. Whether it's through slow enforcement, the writing off of debt, or imposing unnecessary fees and unaffordable payments on families, the CMS is having a direct negative impact on many households' finances as they navigate a brutal cost of living crisis." Linda, how needed is this proposed overhaul of the CMS?
Right. I think it's first of all really important, you know, to recognise that there are many, many families which suffer family breakup for all sorts of different reasons, that don't have to resort to the child maintenance service because they can come to a voluntary arrangement on making sure that their children's lives are properly funded. So the CMS comes in to help, on one hand, to help people sort things out if agreement can't be reached properly, and on the other hand, where there is just a refusal to meet any agreement whatsoever. So that's the role of the CMS. And I have to say, I found as a constituency MSP that David Linden's quite right. An overhaul is needed because it is slow, laborious and ineffective. And he's, you know, the report that he's talking about, end collect and pay fees for low-income households, for example, that makes sense. But I think the big thing is faster action. Because at the end of the day, it's the children that are really suffering. You know, whatever parent is looking after the children on sometimes on a sole basis, sometimes, you know, sharing responsibilities, but they have to make sure that they can adequately provide for the child, the roof over their head, the food that they eat, the clothes they need for school, all the different things that children need. So fast action is absolutely necessary. So yes, I think this has been a long time coming, and I really hope that this report gets unanimous backing across Westminster. Because again, it's a Westminster. Everything we're talking about tonight seems to be Westminster issues.
Bit of a running theme here.
Yeah. Which just again is very, very frustrating because I really believe that in Scotland we could do things in a much better way. So, yes, David's quite right. The Work and Pensions Committee is quite right. There are issues. These issues need to be resolved. And it's the welfare of the children that are most important at the end of the day. Whether it be, because it's a difficult issue. I mean, some people end up with 2 families. It happens. That's life. So you've got to make sure that all the children in any of these situations are adequately cared for. And it's not just in terms of the CMS. It also brings in the wider issue of welfare generally. And of course, we have a Westminster government that has dramatically reduced welfare for people in need. So again, it's like everything else. You can't look at something in isolation. You've always got to look at the bigger picture. So yes, changes are required, but we have to look at the bigger picture as well and make sure that everything that affects the welfare of children and the well-being of families come together to create that.
Investment in clean energy and the low-carbon economy fell sharply in the UK last year, even as rival nations were increasing their firepower in the global green race, data shows. The UK's investment in the energy transition fell by 10% from $31 billion to $28 billion from 2021 to 2022, while similar investment in the US rose by about 24% to $141 billion, and in Germany by 17% to $55 billion. Across the EU, investment in the energy transition away from fossil fuels rose by $26 billion last year to $180 billion in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The figures, which cover public and private sector investment, come from research by the House of Commons Library and appear to show the UK falling behind at a crucial time. The US, through the Inflation Reduction Act, is planning a $369 billion expansion of low-carbon efforts, and the EU is similarly pursuing green growth. In the UK, renewable energy generation has been in a mixed picture in recent years. Offshore wind has grown substantially, but onshore wind farms have been almost impossible to build in England since the planning laws were changed in 2015, while there has been hesitation over solar farms. The government has also refused to mandate solar panels on the roofs of new buildings. Last month, the UK government unveiled a raft of measures intended to boost the low-carbon economy. But the announcements were overshadowed as ministers first labelled the measures Green Day, then reneged to rebrand it as Energy Security Day. There was no new money for the plans, and the centrepiece, investment of £20 billion over 20 years in carbon capture and storage technology in the North Sea, was called into doubt by scientists. The data covers all investment in the energy transition, which includes renewable energy, electric vehicles, electrified heat such as heat pumps, hydrogen, energy storage, and carbon capture and storage. Previous data collated by the House of Commons Library up to 2020 focused on renewable energy, so data from before 2020 cannot be directly compared, but it also shows a large fall in the UK's investment in renewable energy. From 2016, when investment hit $24 billion, renewable energy investment fell sharply to just $7.6 billion in 2017, according to the research. UK spending on renewables recovered slightly in 2018 to $8.8 billion, but then slumped again to $5.3 billion in 2019. Linda, what does this fall in UK clean energy investment mean for the UK going forward?
Oh my goodness, there's so much in that report you've just made, Lewis. I think it's interesting too that when you look at the figures, some of the falls pre-pandemic as well. So this is something that can't blame on the pandemic. This has been something that the UK government has consistently been carrying through. And I'm interested that they're refusing to mandate solar panels on the roofs of new buildings, because it's a few years ago now that they stopped the grants that I think it was Ed Miliband had brought in as part of the Labour government pre-2010. He'd brought in very good grants actually for household solar panels and good tariffs, etc. So the Tories stopped all that as well. So this has been something they've been doing consistently. But, you know, a lot of this gets masked because Scotland actually does pretty well in UK terms. You know, when you look at, you know, as you said there, that the planning restrictions in England are such that onshore wind farms are proving difficult. So Scotland punches well above its weight in UK terms in terms of renewables. And what that does is make the UK figures, when they look at percentage-wise, not too bad. And it reminds me of what the UK did with our oil all these years ago, because oil was used to fund the service and finance economy in London and the southeast, and Scotland lost out yet again. So I just seem to see history repeating itself here. Again, we talked earlier about the UK's global standing, and when you look at these figures, the UK's global standing is going down in yet another part of life. And it always puzzles me how we have people in the UK who believe in the UK, who seem to still think we're best in the world at all sorts of things. And a UK government that is still jingoistic in all that regard. Yet the evidence is that right across the world, right across the developed world, people are recognising that the UK is on the skids actually and going well downward all the time in every aspect. This is another aspect of it.
Microsoft's president said Brexit Britain was worse for business than the EU in a stinging attack on the UK's decision to block a $69 billion deal to take over Activision Blizzard. Microsoft rounded on the Competition and Markets Authority today after a surprise decision to block its planned takeover of the Call of Duty game developer, with its president, Brad Smith, describing it as the darkest day in our 4 decades in Britain. We were of course very disappointed about the CMA's decision, but more than that, unfortunately, I think it's bad for Britain, Smith told the BBC. There's a clear message here. The European Union is a more attractive place to start a business if you want to someday sell it. The English Channel has never seemed wider. Smith attacked the government's failure to deliver on the claimed benefits of Brexit. He said, "For all of us who had some hope that post-Brexit the UK would construct a structure that would be more flexible, be better for investment, be better for technology, we're now finding that the opposite appears to be true." He said the CMA decision would discourage innovation and investment in the United Kingdom, and I think in that sense the impact of this decision is far broader than on Microsoft or this acquisition alone. People's confidence in technology in the United Kingdom has been severely shaken. This dispute marks the biggest test of the CMA's authority since the UK's departure from the EU, when the regulator assumed powers previously held by the European Commission, and it is the first major decision under its newly appointed chief executive, Sarah Cardell, who was confirmed in post into December. The regulator said it was blocking the deal over concerns it would harm competition in the cloud gaming market. The tie-up would have created a gaming behemoth, merging Activision's titles such as World of Warcraft, Hearthstone, Candy Crush, Saga, and Overwatch, with Microsoft's first-party developers, its Xbox consoles, and its control of PC gaming. Smith called the decision the darkest day in Microsoft's 4 decades in the UK. Linda, what are your thoughts on the CMA's decision here?
Well, Lewis, I'm listening to what you're saying here and I'm thinking, the only thing I understood in that whole game thing was Candy Crush, because I know that my granddaughter plays it. I would not pretend in any way to be an expert in any of this stuff, but I did listen to the interview with Mr. Smith on radio this morning, and he was a very smooth talker, I have to say. I don't have a huge sympathy for Microsoft generally, or for these massive corporations and takeovers. But what really did chime with me was his comments about the European Union countries being more attractive places to set up in business. And I think that is a marker Brexit, and we've heard that many, many times before. So I've no reason to disbelieve that part of what he was saying. I think that's probably true. It's interesting that the CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority, have come out with their decision before the EU has. So I'm really interested to see what the EU will do here. If the EU do agree it, that would reinforce that message that Mr. Smith is talking about, that they're a far better place to be doing business than the UK is. So I think it's all really interesting, and we've got to see what pans out here. But, again, we were told that UK would do everything so much better than the EU ever could, or that we could as part of the EU. Another thing that Mr. Smith said that really interested me was that they found it almost impossible to be talking to anyone in the UK, whether it be government, whether it be the CMA. I think he was talking about the CMA particularly. Really difficult to actually talk to anybody, to answer some of their questions, to clarify some of their issues, where he said they were having an ongoing dialogue with the EU on the same questions. So I think that's worrying too, because I think you should always give the space for talk, explanation, and revision if necessary. So, as I say, Microsoft's not a particular corporation that I would be going out to bat for, but I think some of the stuff that they've been saying about the EU being a better place to do business than the UK rings very true with me.
And with this being the first major decision made by the CMA since coming into these new powers, and with it being an almost unexpected block of this takeover, do you think this could be almost an example of them wanting to reinforce their authority and try and be taken seriously as this new regulatory body?
Yeah, do you know, you might have a point, Lewis. I hadn't thought of it that way. But yeah, you could well have a point. They're sort of flexing their muscles straight off. But the result of that could be that if the EU does go ahead with it, other potential investors would just totally bypass the UK for any of these things from then on. So I don't know when the EU is to make its decision. I understand it's quite soon. So I think that's certainly something we should come back to. And I'll mug up on video games if you have me back.
Advice columnist E. Jean Carroll told a New York jury on Wednesday that Donald Trump raped her, leaving her unable to have a romantic relationship, and then shattered my reputation by denying the attack occurred. Carroll testified in her civil lawsuit seeking damages for battery after Trump allegedly sexually assaulted her in a New York department store changing room in 1996, and for defamation after he accused her of lying and perpetrating a hoax when she went public with her accusations in a book. Miss Carroll said, "I'm here because Donald Trump raped me, and when I wrote about it, he said it didn't happen. He lied and shattered my reputation, and I'm here to try and get my life back," she told the jury. Trump denies the accusations. Before Miss Carroll testified, Judge Lewis Kaplan warned Trump may have crossed the line into jury tampering after the former president posted an attack on his social media site Truth Social, calling Carroll's accusations a made-up scam and a witch hunt. Kaplan called Trump's post entirely inappropriate and warned they could become a potential source of liability for him. After she took the stand, Miss Carroll described how she met Trump as she was leaving the Bergdorf Goodman luxury department store and described in detail the events which followed, and describing how Trump is alleged to have raped her. Later, Miss Carroll shed tears as she explained that she found it impossible to even smile at a man she was attracted to after the alleged rape, and that she had not had sex since. Miss Carroll said that she had been subject to considerable abuse by Trump and his supporters for going public about the alleged attack, including the then president's dismissal of her as a liar. Asked if she regretted accusing Trump given the consequences, Carroll's voice broke. "I regretted this about 100 times, but in the end, being able to get my day in court finally is everything," she said through tears. The trial continues. Linda, what are your thoughts on this case?
Well, first of all, the trial continues. So the court has to reach its decision, and it's not for me or anyone else to talk in any detail about what's been said in court, other than Judge Lewis Kaplan having to warn Mr. Trump about potential jury tampering. I was absolutely appalled when I read that he'd put an attack on his social media site for the world to see about a woman who is in court at the moment and who has accused him. And to me, it's just a mark of that man, the arrogance of it, the narcissism that he has, the belief that he could never do anything wrong and that he can behave in any way that he wishes, that he can sit there and put something out on social media to totally undermine the way that formal court proceedings are going on. So, just awful, and the judge was quite right to give that severe warning. So, I mean, from that, I can't say anything about the case. The court will reach its decision. But I'm stunned that this man is still being mooted as a potential presidential candidate by the Republican Party. I mean, this is just another in a long line of situations that Mr. Trump has found himself in. Yet they still think that this is someone who is fit to be a Republican candidate. I don't know what's happened to the Republican Party in the US. It used to be a very, very reasonable, I would say. I mean, people forget it was actually, Abe Lincoln was part of the Republican Party, you know. The history of the Republican Party is quite a proud one. And here we are, not just with a particular president having trashed that reputation, but with elected members round about him who help him do so. I find it very, very worrying, disturbing, and bewildering, I have to say. I hope that Trump disappears somewhere as a result of one of the many accusations that are made against him, and that we just never have to listen to him again.
People are being asked for their views on how the planning system can support healthy, thriving and connected communities as part of a consultation launched by the Scottish Government. As part of implementation of a national planning framework draft guidance has been prepared to support people to meet the majority of their daily needs within a reasonable distance of their home, preferably through active travel or use of public transport. The local living and the 20-minute neighbourhood concepts contained in NPF4 will help the planning system to deliver sustainable and resilient places, deliver net zero ambitions, reduce social isolation, promote active travel and provide access to green space. Planning Minister Joe Fitzpatrick launched the consultation at the Scottish Young Planners Network annual conference in Stirling. Mr Fitzpatrick said, "Local living and 20-minute neighbourhood policies will deliver many long-standing ambitions for the planning system by supporting thriving communities and providing multiple benefits for people and the environment. We want to help people to meet their daily needs within a reasonable distance of their homes while helping them live healthier lives and contributing towards the achievement of our net zero targets." The deadline for responding to the consultation is Thursday, the 20th of July. Linda, what do you think of the idea of these 20-minute neighbourhoods?
I'm glad you said idea, because I think it's a wonderful idea, but it's just another name for wonderful ideas along the same lines that we've been having for decades now. So I'm a wee bit sceptical, I have to say. I mean, one of the main, of course, there's a lot of main issues with this. One big issue, we ripped the heart out of cities and towns many, many years ago when we talked about urban regeneration, etc., etc. And we're probably bearing the results of that now when you look at all the out-of-town retail outlets, for example, and city and town centres in a bit of a mess. We stopped people living near, in some cases, we stopped people living near the shops, near their work. We built motorways and the car was king. So we're suffering from that now, and this is the latest thing. 20-minute neighbourhood, you're supposed to be able to get about and meet most of your needs. Now that's fine if you're in a city and a scheme comes up. In some small towns that might be fine as well, but not everybody is able to work from home or able to work near their home. And then I think of the diversity that is Scotland in terms of rural living and indeed island living. So how are we going to achieve that there? So I think an idea is good, but you really have to have resources and a lot of work behind it. So it'll be interesting to see what the consultation comes up with. It will be interesting to see what the Scottish Government and local authorities, because it's not just the Scottish Government here, are able to put in place to meet some of the recommendations. Be interesting to see what ideas just quietly get pushed aside. And again, I keep talking about it tonight, bigger picture, public transport. There's real issues with public transport in rural areas. So, yeah, I think I've got a sceptical welcome to the idea.
Cautious optimism.
Cautious optimism. I wouldn't even go as far as say optimism, to be honest. Cautiously hopeful that something may come of this.
Scotland's digital healthcare provider, NHS24, is celebrating a new milestone since the launch of its health app, NHS24 Online. Since going live in November of 2022, the app has recently surpassed 20,000 downloads, and feedback from clinicians and other health boards in the NHS Scotland has been positive. Anthony McDavid, Director of Pharmacy for NHS Shetland and Orkney, explains why NHS24 Online could be key in transforming how people, particularly from remote and rural communities, access health information in Scotland. You can imagine people on the islands live quite remotely from different health services. There are areas where people may have to travel great distances to get the clinical appointments they need or to understand what their next steps are. With this app, we can link people up with the different services to determine where to go first. It's a great tool to help connect the dots for people seeking care. The app is the latest online offering from NHS24, which is Scotland's provider of digital and telephone-based health and care services such as the 111 service and NHS Inform. It hosts a virtual chatbot function to provide advice on a range of issues, including eye problems, flu-like illness, or running out of medicine, and can also help people find their nearest health and care services, such as GPs, pharmacies, and dentists, using postcodes or location data. The NHS24 Online app provides people in Scotland an additional channel to find out more about their symptoms, how to safely self-manage illnesses and conditions, and when and where to seek further medical advice if required. NHS24 Online can be downloaded free from Apple or Android app stores. Linda, who do you think will benefit the most from access to an app like this?
Those who are already digitally aware. I think it's good news. I don't mean to put it down. I think it's good news. I think they've done really good work. And there are those in remoter areas who will find this really useful. But we should never forget about people who don't have smartphones, who don't have a laptop that they can just go onto, who for all sorts of different reasons just have not embraced or indeed have never been given the opportunity to embrace the digital age. So these people should never be left behind. So along with this, there has to be a network of people that can be spoken to, whether it be in GP surgeries, whether it be in advice surgeries that people have. Citizens' advice came to my mind straight away. And then I have a memory that Shetland doesn't have a citizens' advice service, although they do have other kinds of volunteer services. But yeah, so it has to be in mind that there's got to be other services available. Whether it be the ability to pick up a phone and speak to somebody who can access the information for you, whether it be able to be able to wander in to some kind of service within 20 minutes of where you live, Lewis, that is able to set you in the right direction. GP surgeries, there's difficulties there. We all know that. We all know there's people feeling great frustration that they're finding it difficult to access certain GP surgeries. So, as part of an NHS service, I think it's fine. But it's always got to be just part of. And I think that should always be emphasised. I saw the press release today that came out from NHS24 on that. And whilst it looks like good news for NHS 24, I think it could have done with a bit of extra wording in there about people's options if they can't get online.
So you worry that with the success of the app moving forward, it might lead to alternatives and more traditional means of accessing this healthcare information almost being left behind?
Yeah, well, I've got friends who are not good on their smartphones, or not good on their iPads and stuff, who phone me, and I'm not that good at it, but who phone me and say, they told me I had to go online, I don't know what to do. Now,
Of course,
that's difficult.
There is still the 111 telephone service.
Yeah. Yeah, the worry is, though, that it's quite a long time you have to wait for that at the moment, although people work really hard on it. The worry is that that gets reduced as these things grow. And it may well be that the marginalised number of people becomes fewer. But these few people are still very, very important. We should never, ever forget that.
Well, that's it for this evening, but before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated, and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. Good night, and thank you for watching.